Sorry, thank you very much for the opportunity to come to this conference today and to talk on this topic. Like a lot of people, I suppose it's one that has certainly attracted my attention and interest, although this is my first visit to Korea in 3 years, so I certainly wasn't present last year when, and early this year when all the excitement was happening. And yet, I certainly personally have a long-standing interest in Korea, and I can say that I was here during some of the earlier renditions of Candlelight Protests. And that's something I sort of wanted to talk about a little bit today, I suppose, was to focus on a slightly different aspect of the protests than some of the other people have done so far. I think a lot of the other speakers today have, and I must say we really enjoyed the presentations, but a lot of people have been talking about, I suppose, some of the causes of the protests, the patterns of mobilisation, and the sort of the types of people who have been involved. I, on the other hand, want to focus more on the final stages of the protests and indeed the way in which they've gradually wound down. And perhaps indeed the possibility of the Candlelight protests being institutionalised, as this part of the program is suggesting. In order to do that, as I said, I wanted to hark back to some of the earlier episodes of the Candlelight protests that we've known about in the last 15 years or so, and sort of try to draw something from that. And I think a good starting point is to think about, I suppose, the nature of protests in the first place. And to sort of think of it, often protests are a way for a disempowered and a non-traditional set of political actors to demand justice, to seek to redress a perceived injustice. Quite often that injustice is one that's perpetuated by the state or the government, and so you have this slightly paradoxical situation where an excluded majority, or at least representatives of them, are seeking to seek, as I said, redress from the body that they perceive often has actually perpetuated the injustice in the first place. So, and yet, and often, and again, as was just discussed, they're sort of offering up their case and hoping that elected representatives or the Constitutional Court will adjudicate and to sort of carry out that redress. So in a way, I said, protests should be seen as a relatively extraordinary event there in this sense. And I think also that therefore they're distinguishable from the sort of, should I say, very legitimate activities that more conventional political actors should and do undertake as a matter of course. So if you think of political oppositions, trade unions, and other non-state actors, that is their work, and they perform a very valuable role in democracy in doing so. What we're talking about in the case of, say, the Candlelight protests are those non-traditional and non-professional politicians, political actors, if you will, who are taking part. So it's trying to make sense a bit of that. Because one of the things that I sort of want to focus on today, I suppose, is the ways in which the governments have a particular ability, I suppose, to help to demobilise and de-escalate these protests, and to sort of bring an end to that episode of protest there. And I suppose the sort of one of the, it might also be noted that the nature of the protest matters a lot, and it might often be said that the cause of the protests are not always about the government. They can sometimes be about opposition forces too, and opposition political forces too. So the possibility and the mode of de-escalation depends a lot on a number of factors, as we'll discuss today. And one thing I suppose I'd take out of the most recent example of the Candlelit protests is that we have a sort of almost a spectacular failure on the part of the government to de-escalate. So essentially, the sitting government headed by Park Geun-hye was forced to resign ultimately and was removed from power. So this is actually a very unusual sort of example, I suppose, given, as I said, this was an extraordinary power or extraordinary action that is meant to seek a redress. This is sort of quite an unusual action, and arguably I think it's something that can really shift the relationship between state and society. So rather than having these patterns of mobilisation, demobilisation and then sort of a return to normalcy, perhaps with, as other speakers have noted today, some degree of political liberalisation, this is a potential sort of a change, and you might sort of say like a exercising of a circuit-breaking power on the part of the citizenry. Okay, so if we look at the sort of history of protests in Korea, we can say it's actually extremely long and deep, as we know, and other speakers have done a much better job than I will of explaining that today. In terms of the sort of the idea of candlelight protests, my understanding is that there's, at least in the 1970s or so, there was sort of sporadic use of the symbol of the candle to as a form of protest, but given the heavily restricted space available to protesters in the 1970s and even through much of the 1980s, we never sort of saw it become such a potent symbol and so widely used as it has in more recent times. So instead we're really talking about, say, the last 15 years, 2002 onwards, where it's sort of become a sort of a potent and effective symbol of protests. But I think it's always just worth thinking about the history anyway. The other point, I suppose, that you can see from the figures here supplied by the Korean National Police is that there are a lot of protests in Korea, but actually very few of them are even what the police would refer to as illegal and violent. So as a proportion of protests that occur, and these are large and small ones, there's very few that are actually ever violent, and that therefore might alienate sort of your general law-abiding citizenry. And in fact, if you look at the numbers there, you'll see that it's a very small proportion overall. So those are just two very superficial things to take out of these numbers. I think the other sort of useful sort of indication here is that you can sort of see that there's been a bit of a shift here in more recent times. Clearly, these figures are not including 2016 and 2017. But there's if you like, while the number of protests as a whole was increasing, the number of that were considered either violent or illegal in the eyes of the police was actually decreasing. And I think you could actually, again, this is maybe just a summation, but you could almost sort of link it to events that happened in about 2008-9 at the time of the widespread and multifaceted protests that occurred against the free trade agreement. And in the midst of that, those set of protests, as I'll mention in a moment, occurred again a candlelit demonstration against beef imports. So again, other people have spoken about that. I'll come back to that one in a moment. But you could almost sort of say that there was a sort of a reaction to essentially. So this wave of protests here in about 2008, 2009 was met with a violent response from the state. So we know that, and did result in a form of de-escalation that sort of essentially turned a lot of protesters off protesting. The first-time protesters went home, so that those mothers with their children who were protesting for the first time were persuaded to go home, and there were a lot of people involved in that process there too. But I think what you can sort of say and so it seems that there has been a sort of a change of tactics overall, and the culmination perhaps was the successful return to sort of peaceful protest at the end of 2016, 2017. Okay. The other thing that should be probably noted from all this is that there are a lot of protests that occur over time, but in fact very few of them result in substantial political change, in true political liberalisation or change. That is also a fact of the matter. Okay. Now, the way that I want to sort of probably help get into an explanation of what's going on here, these patterns of escalation and de-escalation, or mobilisation and demobilisation, is to draw on the work of Charles Tilley and his colleagues, Sidney Tarrow, Doug McAdam, and their sort of contentious politics model. And in particular, I suppose from one of the last books that Charles Tilley was involved in, from 2007, Contentious Politics, he sort of talks about this. He sort of identified sort of the three main elements of a successful social movement, and I think this can sort of help us get a bit of a better idea about how and why certain social movements can succeed in their goals, and why sometimes they can get co-opted. So essentially they identify sort of three main elements there, one being this, that there has to be a willingness to undergo and undertake sustained campaigns of claims against the government. So it's worth sort of thinking about the different elements of that. These are not one-off protests. These are not sort of things that happen once or sort of over the space of a days or weeks. They have to really sort of go quite a distance, sometimes months, in order to be effective. Secondly, the protests have to have a very clear goal in mind, so very clear claim being made on the holders of power. So as I mentioned before, this is often about the redress about a particular form of injustice. So this can be, as we'll mention in a moment, it could be about redressing the death of two Korean schoolgirls who were killed by an American military vehicle in 2002. It might be about returning a duly elected president to office, as occurred in 2004, when it seemed to have been removed on very spurious grounds. Or it might be about sort of overturning the resumption of beef imports in 2008, again on seemingly under great pressure from the US government, despite sort of very few controls being put in place. And in more recent times, of course, it's about sort of perceived abuse of power and sort of giving access to, on an illegal basis to a non-official advisor in the form of Chae Shin-sil. So those sort of claims are very clear. They're relatively concrete and easy for a large number of non-professional politicians, if you will, or non-practicing politicians to get their head around and agree upon. Okay, so that's the sort of the first element that you need. Secondly, sort of Taro and Tilly would tell us, is that we need to have what they call wunk, so sort of repeated displays of worthiness, unity, numbers, so lots of people, and also commitment. So this is where, again, the idea of the weekly protest movement that we saw from October onwards last year is very nicely explained, I think, in terms of the Tillian framework there. So well-behaved protesters who turn up regularly and in ever-increasing numbers. This sort of thing can really capture the imagination, I said, of sort of your non-professional politicians. Thirdly, there's this idea of the repertoire, so that you have to be sort of be doing the same sort of tactics. Sometimes you can vary it, but there has to be sort of identifiable tactic that everyone can be part of and can understand quite easily. And again, we've seen that with the form of the candle. So all you have to do is bring a candle along and hold it up, or sort of hold up light, and that was the powerful symbol being sent. I think these are some of the ways in which we can help to sort of understand how this tactic can be effective, and sort of can capture the imagination and therefore be effective. We'll move on from that. I just want to very briefly, because I realise we're up against time, talk just sort of quickly about the three waves of prior waves of the candlelit demonstrations that we know about in South Korea. And I think arguably they all generally sort of accord with this Tillian framework. Again, I'm not going to claim to have this is an impressionistic analysis, I suppose, but it certainly, I think that it makes a little bit of sense here to understand it in this way. If we think of the 2002 protests, I said the death of the two schoolgirls there. I said the focus was very clear, that it was essentially perceived injustice of the fact that there'd been two children who sort of died in awful circumstances, and a seeming inability of Korean authorities to sort of prosecute the American military officers in question there. And again, these protests initially took the form of quite small in number, but they increased. And of course, they were occurring against a broader background of growing anti-US sentiment, fueled by the impending Iraq War and matters such as that. But anyway, so this sort of protest took form. I said against a very clear background there. And essentially, this protest it said it wasn't against the government. It was against the US military, who, albeit was a ally of the US of the Korean government. So that sort of helped. It sort of, even though it put the then Kim Dae-jung government in a somewhat invidious position, it wasn't necessarily about a claim on the government in the first instance. And essentially this, you might sort of say in some sense there was no justice delivered, because the two military officers were tried internally by the US military and were acquitted of the charges. It was decided that it was an accidental death. It was unavoidable. But the fact that Roh Moo-hyun sort of became the sort of championed the cause and sort of was seen to be sympathetic to the protests, I think was sort of a form of victory for the protest movement, and it was sort of able to be de-escalated in a certain way there. And some people mentioned, of course, his government subsequently sort of did associate very closely with the Candlelight demonstrations. Almost sort of part two, I suppose, of that movement occurred sort of about a year or two later, when I said the new president found himself sort of in great conflict, I suppose, with his political opponents, which culminated, as we know, in his impeachment, or a decision by the National Assembly to launch charges of impeachment on rather spurious grounds. And essentially we saw a similar form of mobilisation here. It was what seemed to be a very clear injustice that someone should be impeached, and the president should be impeached on such spurious grounds. Did lead to large-scale mobilisation, certainly bigger than the ones in 2004. And as we know, it sort of worked its way through. He temporarily stepped aside, and but was able to be returned when the Constitutional Court cleared him of the charges, and of course his own party then had a resounding victory in the 2004 elections too. So again we saw this pattern of mobilisation and then demobilisation, and again it was something that the state was essentially able to control. So again, it probably helped again that those protests were not really ranged against the government as such, but were ranged against these political opponents. Then we sort of have the counterexample, I suppose, in 2007-8 there, and I said an element of which was typified by the Candlelit demonstrations. So remember, this essentially was a larger, you might sort of say, messier incident, in that it was essentially what began as a series of protests against the Chorus FDA. Later on, it sort of took a particular focus on the beef imports. But it should be noted that the KCTU and its allies had actually already been already had a sort of a large protest underway, a series of actions. And it was only in sort of about late May of 2008 when the decision was made to under great pressure, under great US pressure to resume beef imports, that you saw this new group of, I said, if you like, the non-traditional protesters come to the fore. So, and again, that's when all of a sudden we saw school children and the mothers with their children sort of partake in the protests. So the candlelit demonstrations, even though that was a very specific issue, it was part of a larger set of protests. So it was defying that Tillian logic of a very clear focus, because it was sort of getting a little bit lost in that larger set of protests there, and I think this probably contributed to the ability of the government to again essentially co-opt the protests, or shall I say demobilise the protests. So there were a couple of concessions made. There were some of President Lee's advisors who resigned, and he made an apology or two as well, and that seemed to placate to some degree some of the people who were protesting. There was also again from testimony with the participants later on, there was a lot of pressure from husbands as well to sort of come home and sort of not be involved anymore, to not be involved in politics so much. And Chosun Ilbo and other organisations were accusing mothers of politicising their babies and things like that. So there was a lot of pressure put on protesters there, and for various and different reasons, there was a form of de-escalation there. So that sort of happened too, but I said it was certainly a different sort of outcome. Now, and then of course we have the most recent bout of protest there in 2016. Again, very clear focus, sort of relatively narrow one, although there were many other reasons to be perhaps critical of the Park government there. But it did sort of, I said it does sort of fit that Tillian logic, I think, of a clear focus and certainly the exemplary behaviour on the part of the protesters there. All right. To wrap it up then, I said certainly you could sort of say that this, in looking at it in historical political time, this form of protest is relatively new and quite a potent addition to Korea's political culture. You could say that it's, however, it has resulted in, or has met with varying degrees of effectiveness. And it seems that overall, but again, you could say that they tend to be most effective when the focus is quite narrow, and also when the focus, when the movement itself doesn't spill so far out of, shall we say, it doesn't spill into sort of party political grounds. Of course, you could say the removal of a president is an overtly political act. You can't really get anything bigger than that. But there seems to be there seems to be a place, I suppose, in the political culture for this form of protest. However, I think it should be seen again, as mentioned at the beginning, as an extraordinary act. It's probably not going to be. It's probably not possible to sort of formally institutionalise it. Although there are things, of course, that the government can do to open up more political space, and perhaps by doing so make the desirability and necessity for candlelight demonstrations somewhat lower. Thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to the remainder of the conference.